The blood on Dominic Bishop's knuckles had dried to black lace, but the tremor in his fingers was new. 30 years without sleep, 30 years of watching the sun rise through bloodshot eyes, of counting cracks in ceiling plaster instead of sheep, and his body had finally found its limit. Not in a boardroom. Not during a police interrogation. Here, in a meatpacking warehouse at 3:47 a.m., standing over the unconscious body of a traitor who'd thought a bishop could be bought. "Hey there, beautiful people," Dominic's voice cut through the darkness, but it wasn't the man in the warehouse speaking, it was the story itself reaching out, grabbing you by the collar. "Where are you watching from tonight? That couch looking comfortable? Good. Get cozy. But I need you to do something for me first. Hit that subscribe button. No, seriously. Do it now. Because what I'm about to tell you doesn't just defy logic, it rewrites the entire goddamn rulebook of what we think we know about pain, about survival, and about the one woman who could finally put the devil himself to sleep." The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed like dying hornets. Dominic's vision swam. He'd killed 3 men this week, vetted 2 million in counterfeit art, and prevented a war with the Calabrian syndicate by offering them his own docs. But this involuntary shaking, was the first thing that truly terrified him. He pressed his back against the freezer door, feeling the vibration of the industrial compressors through his sweat-soaked shirt. The cold was the only thing keeping him vertical. That, and 30 years of pure, unadulterated rage against the Sandman who'd abandoned him. The sound came first. A vacuum cleaner. Then a voice, tuneless, sweet, humming something that might have been a lullaby if lullabies were meant for alley cats and broken things. Juno Gordon pushed her cart through the plastic strip curtains, her threadbare sneakers silent on the concrete. She was thin in a way that spoke of ramen noodles and skipped meals, with hair the color of rusted wire pulled into a ponytail that had given up halfway through its shift. Her uniform, borrowed, ill-fitting, had Gonzalez embroidered on the breast pocket. She wasn't even supposed to be here. She was covering for Maria Gonzalez, who had 3 kids and the flu. She saw the blood first. Then the body. Then Dominic Bishop, the man whose face had been on every wanted poster in 3 counties, though none of them captured the hollow desperation in his eyes. Her vacuum cleaner hit the floor with a crack. Dom's Beretta appeared in his hand like magic, but his arm wouldn't steady. The sights danced across her face, those wide, impossibly green eyes, the smattering of freckles across a nose that had been broken and never fixed right, the way her lips parted in a silent scream that never came. "Scream," he whispered, his voice raw as gravel. "Please. Just scream so I can." She didn't scream. She looked at the gun, then at his face, then at the tremor in his hand that he couldn't hide. And she did the last thing anyone in her position had ever done in 30 years of Dominic Bishop's reign. She took a step closer. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice soft as the dust motes dancing in the freezer light. "Your cheek. It's bleeding." It wasn't. It was sweat. 30 years, and his body had forgotten how to tell the difference between salt water and blood. "Turn around," he commanded, but the words came out as a plea. "Walk away. Forget you saw. You're going to pass out." Another step. The vacuum cord stretched taut behind her. "I've seen that look. My dad, before his liver gave out. You're about to hit the floor, and if you do, that guy's gonna wake up and kill you." The traitor, Antonio Ricci, his name was Antonio Ricci, groaned from the concrete. Juno crouched. Actually crouched, her knees popping, and picked up the vacuum. She unplugged it with a practiced motion, the silence that followed so profound it rang. "What's your name?" she asked, like they were meeting at a bus stop. Dom's finger rested on the trigger. One twitch. That's all it would take. 30 years of insomnia had taught him that every problem had one solution: elimination. Erase the witness. Erase the threat. Erase anything that might make him vulnerable. But his arm was so heavy. So goddamn heavy. "Dominic," he heard himself say. 30 years. He'd never told a civilian his real name. "I'm Juno." She smiled, and it was the saddest, bravest smile he'd ever seen. "And you're about to become a statistic if you don't sit down. There's a cot in the break room. It's mine. I mean, I'm the only one who uses it. During my lunch. 20 minutes. Sometimes I can actually." She stopped. Her own secrets, catching in her throat. Dominic's world narrowed to a tunnel. The edges went black. The buzzing in his ears wasn't just the fluorescence anymore, it was the sound of every sleepless night, every ghost he'd collected, every drop of blood that had stained his hands since he was 16 years old and watched his father die in a pool of gasoline and broken glass. Juno reached out. Her hand was small, calloused. Her fingernails were bitten to the quick. "Give me the gun," she whispered. "Not because I want it. Because you're going to drop it, and it's going to go off, and then I'm going to have to explain why a dead mobster is bleeding out in my warehouse." My warehouse. The claim was so absurd, so fundamentally wrong, that Dominic almost laughed. Instead, he swayed. Her fingers closed over his wrist. Her skin was cool. Not cold like the freezer door, but cool like river stones in summer. The simple touch sent an electric jolt through his nervous system that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with the kind of human contact he'd purged from his life 3 decades ago. The gun clattered to the concrete. Antonio Ricci's eyes fluttered open. And Dominic Bishop, who had not closed his eyes for 30 years, who had not known a moment of true darkness since he was a boy, felt his knees buckle. But not from exhaustion. From something else. Something that felt dangerously close to surrender. Juno caught him. All 5'4" of her, with her borrowed uniform and her ramen noodle frame, caught 200 pounds of falling kingpin and guided him to the floor with a gentleness that defied physics. "Close your eyes," she murmured, her lips so close to his ear he could feel the vibration of her voice in his bones. "Just for a second. I've got you." He hadn't heard those words in 30 years. Not since his mother, before the fire, before the world became a place where sleep was a liability and trust was a death sentence. Dominic Bishop closed his eyes. And for the first time in 11,000 days, the darkness didn't try to kill him. The question that will keep you watching, the one that burned through my mind when I first heard this story, is simple. What happens when the most dangerous man alive finally gets what he's always wanted? Not power. Not money. Not revenge. Sleep. And the woman who gave it to him? She's about to become the target of every enemy Dominic Bishop ever made. Because in this world, weakness isn't forgiven, it's exploited. And for the first time in 30 years, Dominic Bishop has a weakness. Her name is Juno Gordon. And if you think you know how this ends, if you think you've guessed the twist that made a man who hadn't slept in 3 decades propose to a janitor he met over a bleeding traitor's body, then I need you to do me a favor. Drop a comment below with your theory. Subscribe so you don't miss a single second of what happened next. Because what I'm about to show you, it isn't just a love story. It's the anatomy of how a heart that should have stopped beating 30 years ago learned to beat for someone else. And it all started with a vacuum cleaner, a borrowed uniform, and a question that would change everything. What if the only way to finally rest was to learn how to trust? The seconds stretched into minutes, and the minutes became something Dominic Bishop's body no longer knew how to measure. For 30 years, time had been his enemy, a relentless, ticking metronome that marked every heartbeat, every blink, every moment he fought to stay upright in a world that kept spinning while he remained frozen in perpetual wakefulness. But here, slumped against a freezer door in a meatpacking warehouse that smelled of bleach and old death, time simply stopped. Juno Gordon held him. That was the absurdity of it. Her arms, thin as they were, trembling with the effort, circled his shoulders, pressing his face against her collarbone where her pulse beat a steady rhythm against his cheek. She smelled like industrial cleaner and the ghost of some cheap vanilla perfume, and the combination was the most human thing he'd encountered in decades. "You're safe," she whispered, repeating it like a prayer she didn't quite believe. Just rest. I've got you." Behind them, Antonio Ricci groaned again, shifting on the concrete. Juno's head snapped up, her eyes, those impossible green eyes, finding the Beretta where it had fallen. Without letting go of Dominic, she kicked it. Not hard. Just enough to send it skittering beneath the industrial meat grinder, where it disappeared into shadow. Dominic felt the darkness closing in. Not the darkness of unconsciousness, that grim, empty void that had haunted him for 30 years, but something else. Something warm. Something like surrender. His breath hitched, a sound so foreign it might have been another man's death rattle, and then his body made a choice his mind had forgotten existed. He slept. 3 hours later, Juno sat on the break room cot, the same cot where she'd been catching 20-minute fragments of rest for the past 6 months, and watched the monster breathe. Dominic Bishop was sprawled across the thin mattress, one arm thrown over his eyes, the other dangling off the side where his fingers twitched occasionally, grasping at dreams. The cot was too small for him, built for people like Juno, people who'd learned to make themselves compact, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had no room for them. She should have run. That was the logical thing, the survival thing. She'd seen things tonight that guaranteed her death if the wrong people found out. A man beaten half to death in the main warehouse. A gun. And this man, this beautiful, terrifying man with the face of a fallen saint and the hands of a killer, had been at the center of it all. But when he'd looked at her, when his dark eyes had met hers across that warehouse floor, she'd seen something she recognized. Not violence. Not even fear. Something deeper. The look of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than what the world had decided they were. Juno knew that look. She'd been wearing it since she was 16. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, the cracked screen illuminating her face with sickly blue light. 3 missed calls from Lenny. A text, "Where the hell are you? Rent's due. Don't make me come find you." Lenny was her landlord. Also her second cousin. Also the man who'd accidentally walked in on her in the shower last month and spent the next week forgetting to fix her broken lock. She owed him for 3 months back rent on a studio apartment that smelled like mold and had a view of a brick wall. The total was $2,400. She had $47 in her checking account. She looked back at Dominic. Even in sleep, his face was tense, his jaw clenched like he was fighting battles in his dreams. Or maybe just continuing the same one he'd been fighting for 30 years. 30 years. She'd almost laughed when he'd said it, thinking it was a metaphor. But looking at him now, she believed it. The man was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. It was cellular. Soul deep. Her fingers itched to touch his forehead, to smooth away the lines that carved his face into a map of old wars. Instead, she stood, her knees protesting, and moved to the small sink in the corner. She splashed water on her face, the liquid cold and sharp, then filled a paper cup and placed it on the floor beside the cot. A sound made her turn. Dominic's eyes were open. Not slowly, not groggily, but all at once, sharp, focused, the sleep gone as if it had never been. "How long?" His voice was rough, disused. 3 hours, Juno whispered. Maybe 3.5. He sat up so fast the cot frame groaned in protest. "Ricky." Still unconscious. I checked. Tied his hands with extension cords. Not great knots, but, she shrugged, a gesture that encompassed her entire life. She'd never been great at anything, just good enough to survive. Dominic stared at her. Really stared, like he was trying to memorize her face for the moment he'd have to order her execution. Juno forced herself not to look away. She'd learned that trick from her father, the year before the cirrhosis took him. Never look away. Make them see you as a person, not a problem. "You didn't run," he said. "You needed to sleep. People don't do that. Not for someone like me." Juno's laugh was bitter and brief. "People like you don't usually collapse in warehouses where people like me work. We're kind of invisible. It's our superpower." She turned away, busying herself with straightening the already straight cot sheets. Behind her, she heard Dominic stand. He moved silently for such a large man, a predator's grace that made her spine prickle with awareness. "What's your last name?" he asked. She shouldn't tell him. Every instinct screamed don't give him anything he can use against you. But she'd already given him more than a name. She'd given him sleep. "Gordon." "Juno Gordon." He tested it like a key in a lock. "Why are you working the night shift in a place like this? Why haven't you slept in 30 years? The question hung between them, a challenge and an offering. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in something like relief. "I watched my family burn when I was 16, he said, the words flat and rehearsed, like he'd said them to himself so many times they'd lost their shape. "My father, my mother, my little sister. Arson. Rival family. I was supposed to die with them. Got out through a basement window. But something broke that night. The part of you that knows how to turn off, how to let go. It just stopped working." Juno turned. He was standing by the window, a small, grimy thing that looked out onto the loading dock where the first hints of dawn were staining the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Every time I close my eyes, he continued, I see them. Not dead. Not peaceful. Burning. Screaming. So I stopped closing them. You can go a long time without sleep if you have enough anger. Enough money. Enough people who are afraid of you. He looked back at her. Your turn. She wanted to lie. To make something up that was less pathetic, less true. But the way he looked at her, like he was actually waiting, actually cared about the answer, unlocked something she'd kept bolted shut for years. My dad drank himself to death after my mom left, she said, the words tumbling out. I was 17. No family. No college fund. Just a diploma and an eviction notice. I've been working 3 jobs since. This one, a diner during the day, and sometimes I clean offices on weekends. I'm good at being invisible. At cleaning up other people's messes. She paused. At not asking questions. A silence stretched between them, thin and fragile as spider silk. I should kill you, Dominic said, but there was no weight behind it. Just observation. You won't. How do you know? Because I gave you something nobody else could. And you're not sure if you can get it back without me. The audacity of her own words made her breath catch. But they were true. She could see it in his face, the hunger, the desperation. For 30 years, this man had owned everything money could buy except the one thing that was free. And she'd handed it to him like it was nothing. Dominic took a step toward her. Then another. He moved into her space, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his pulse hammered in his throat. What's your price? He asked. I don't. Everyone has a price, Juno Gordon. Money. Protection. A way out. Name it. She thought of Lenny's texts. Of the rent. Of the lock that still didn't work and the way his eyes tracked her when she climbed the stairs. I need $2,000, she heard herself say. For rent. Back rent. And my lock fixed. The number was so small, so insignificant in the world Dominic Bishop inhabited, that he actually smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf who'd just been asked for a scrap instead of the whole kill. Done, he said. But there's a condition. Here it was. The trap. She'd been stupid to think. You come with me. Tonight. Now. Where? Doesn't matter. Wherever I go for the next week, you go. You sleep when I sleep. Or when I need to sleep. He paused, and for the first time, she heard vulnerability in his voice. I need to know if it was a fluke. Or if you actually did something. Juno's mind raced. A week with a mafia boss? It was suicide. It was insane. It was 5,000, she said, surprising herself. For the week. And you fix my lock. And you make sure my landlord never bothers me again. Done. They shook on it. His hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused and utterly certain. The deal was struck, and Juno Gordon, who had survived by being invisible, by being small, by needing nothing, had just sold the most dangerous commodity in the world. A good night's sleep. 2 days before, in a penthouse that overlooked the city like a throne, Dominic Bishop had stood before his council and felt his empire begin to crack. They are testing you, said Viktor Volkov, his oldest friend and most ruthless enforcer. Viktor was a man built from broken glass and vodka, with eyes the color of winter and a loyalty that had been earned, not bought. The Calabrians, the Russians, even the damn Irish in Hell's Kitchen. They are hearing rumors. What rumors? Dominic had asked, though he already knew. That you're weak. Viktor's voice dropped. That you haven't been sleeping. That you're making mistakes. Dominic had turned to the window, watching the city lights blur into smears of color. He hadn't told Viktor the truth. Hadn't told anyone. 30 years of insomnia was a weakness, and weaknesses got exploited. But lately, it had gotten worse. The tremors. The blurred vision. The moments where his mind would simply skip. Like a broken record. I need a solution, he'd said, more to his reflection than to Viktor. There's a woman, Viktor had replied. In Hell's Kitchen. Some kind of healer. People pay her for dreams. Dominic had laughed, the sound bitter. I'm not paying for dreams. You're paying for survival. Now, looking at Juno Gordon as she gathered her things from the break room, her threadbare backpack, her phone charger, the half-eaten protein bar that was probably her dinner, Dominic wondered if Viktor had sent him to the right place after all. Not a healer. Not a mystic. Just a girl who'd learned to survive by being invisible in a world where monsters like him roamed free. 1 week, he said again, as much to remind himself as her. 1 week, she agreed. And then we never see each other again. She believed it. He could see it in her face, that desperate hope that this was just a transaction, that she could take his money and disappear back into her life of 3 jobs and borrowed uniforms and a lock that didn't work. Dominic Bishop had built his empire on understanding what people really wanted, beneath what they said they wanted. And as he watched Juno Gordon tie her rust-colored hair back into that defeated ponytail, he saw it clear as day. She wanted to be invisible again. But Dominic Bishop, who had not slept in 30 years, who had just felt the first real darkness of his adult life pressed against this girl's shoulder, had already decided. Juno Gordon would never be invisible again. Because somewhere between the vacuum cleaner and the cot, between the blood on the concrete and the gold flecks in his eyes, she'd become the only thing standing between him and the darkness he'd been running from for 3 decades. And in this world, the things that save you are always the things they come for first. The Escalade smelled like leather and violence, a sanitized version of the world Dominic had built. Juno sat pressed against the passenger door, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield, watching the city blur past in streaks of neon and shadow. Neither of them had spoken since they'd left the warehouse, since Dominic had made a single phone call and 3 men in black had appeared from nowhere to deal with Antonio Ricci's still-breathing body. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice small against the engine's hum. "My place," Dominic said, but his eyes were on the rearview mirror, scanning for tails. "For now." Juno's phone buzzed again. Lenny's name flashed on the cracked screen, a digital threat glowing in the dark. Dominic's hand shot out, faster than thought, and plucked the device from her grip. "Hey." He rolled down the window and tossed the phone into the East River. "That was my phone," Juno said, incredulity breaking through her fear. "My only phone. And now it's evidence that doesn't exist." Dominic's tone was clinical. "You think Lenny's the only one tracking you? You just became the most valuable person in 5 boroughs. Act like it." The words landed like a physical blow. Valuable. Her. Juno Gordon, who'd spent her life being less than nothing, was suddenly worth more than the art Dominic forged, more than the docs he'd given away, more than the blood on his knuckles. They pulled into the underground garage of a building that looked like it had been carved from obsidian and bad intentions. Viktor Volkov was waiting, leaning against a pillar, a cigarette dangling from his lips despite the no-smoking signs. "Who's the girl?" Viktor asked, his Russian accent thickening the words into weapons. "Juno Gordon," Dominic said, moving to shield her with his body, a gesture so instinctive it surprised them both. "She's with me." Viktor's eyes narrowed. "We need to talk. Alone. Whatever you have to say, you say in front of her." The challenge hung in the air, a line drawn in concrete dust. Viktor studied Juno with the cold precision of a man calculating how many pieces he could break her into. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a defiance she didn't feel. Something in her expression made Viktor's mouth twitch, not into a smile, but into recognition. "Fine," he said, dropping his cigarette and grinding it under his boot. "But you're not going to like it." The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, 40 stories above a city that looked like a circuit board of light and shadow. Juno stood at the window, her reflection pale and ghostly, while Dominic and Viktor spoke in hushed tones across the room. She couldn't hear them, but she could feel it, the tension coiling tighter, the way Viktor's gestures became sharper, the way Dominic's shoulders stiffened. Then Dominic went still. The kind of stillness that comes before a bomb detonates, before a bullet leaves the chamber, before a king decides who lives and who dies. He turned slowly, his dark eyes finding hers across the expanse of marble and distance. The look in them wasn't the exhaustion from before. It was something else. Something that made her take an involuntary step back. "Juno," he said, her name a verdict. "Come here." She crossed the room on legs that felt like borrowed bone. Viktor had spread photographs across the coffee table, old ones, creased and faded, showing a house that had once been beautiful before fire had eaten it alive. A family. A smiling boy who looked like Dominic. A woman with his eyes. A little girl with his smile. And a man. A man with rust-colored hair and freckles and a nose that had been broken and never set right. Do you know this man? Dominic asked, his voice stripped of everything but the question itself. Juno looked down at the photograph. Her father's face stared back at her, younger, healthier, but undeniably him. The man who'd taught her to ride a bike before the drinking started. The man who'd read her bedtime stories before her mother left. The man who'd died in a pool of his own vomit at age 42, his liver finally surrendering to a war it couldn't win. That's my father, she whispered. Charles Gordon. The silence that followed was absolute. Viktor shifted, his hand moving toward the gun at his waist. Dominic didn't move at all. Your father, Dominic repeated, each word precise as a scalpel, burned my family alive. 30 years ago. He was a torch for hire. Cheap, desperate, good with accelerants. The Calabrians paid him $50,000 to make sure the Bishop family stopped breathing. Juno's world tilted on its axis. The room spun. No, he was a contractor. He built things. He built fires, Viktor interrupted, sliding another photograph across the table. This one showed her father being handed an envelope by a man with Calabrian tattoos visible even in the black and white image. We have receipts. Testimony. He died 6 months ago, but his debt didn't. The photograph in her hands trembled. Juno looked up at Dominic, searching his face for something, mercy, disbelief, anything but the cold, hard truth she saw there. That's why you can't sleep, she said, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. That's why you saw him. Every time you closed your eyes. Dominic's nod was barely perceptible. Every night for 30 years. The irony was so sharp it cut. Juno Gordon, who'd spent her life cleaning up her father's messes, had just handed his greatest victim the one thing he'd always wanted. Peace. Rest. Forgiveness in the form of sleep. Viktor pulled his gun from its holster, the sound loud in the quiet room. The Calabrians know you have her. They're already moving. They think you're keeping her as payback. As leverage. Let them think it, Dominic said, but his eyes never left Juno's face. They're going to come for her, Viktor pressed. And when they do, they'll use her to get to you. She's a liability. You know what you have to do. Juno did know. She'd always known, ever since she'd seen the blood on the warehouse floor. In Dominic Bishop's world, liabilities were eliminated. Erased. Made to disappear. But Dominic didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for her. His hand caught her wrist, pulling her close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes had gone dark with something that looked like grief. Tell me you didn't know, he said, his voice low and urgent. Look at me and tell me you didn't know. I didn't, she said, and the truth of it rang between them like a bell. I swear I didn't. Viktor chambered around. Dominic. Shut up. Dominic's command cut through the air like a whip. He kept his grip on Juno, his thumb tracing circles on her pulse point, a touch so gentle it contradicted everything she knew about him. If I let you walk out that door, they'll find you within the hour. If I keep you here, I'm declaring war. Then what do we do? Juno asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dominic's smile was sharp and sad. We make them think they've already won. The plan came together in seconds, Dominic's mind working with a clarity that surprised even him. For the first time in 30 years, he wasn't just reacting, he was strategizing with something other than pure survival instinct. He was strategizing with Juno's life as the centerpiece. Call the Calabrians, he told Viktor. Tell them I'll trade her. Tomorrow night. The old docks. Just me and her, unarmed. Viktor's eyes widened. That's a suicide play. That's exactly what they'll think. Dominic's hand tightened on Juno's wrist. But they won't know she's not the leverage, they'll know she's the trap. Juno's heart hammered against her ribs. What does that mean? It means, Dominic said, turning to face her fully, that for the next 24 hours, you're not just a janitor who gave me 3 hours of sleep. You're the woman I married. You're the weakness they think they can exploit. And when they come for you, they'll find out what happens when you corner a man who's finally learned how to dream again. The word married hung between them, absurd and electric. That's insane, Juno breathed. So is sleeping with the daughter of the man who killed my family, Dominic shot back. But here we are. Viktor watched them, his expression unreadable. If you're wrong about her. I'm not. Dominic's certainty was absolute. He pulled Juno closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face. The touch was intimate, possessive, and for a heartbeat, Juno forgot about fathers and fires and 30 years of blood-soaked vengeance. Trust me, he whispered, his lips close enough to taste her fear. For 24 hours, trust me with everything. And I'll give you a life where you never have to be invisible again. It was the worst deal she'd ever been offered. A fake marriage to a real monster. A trap built on the bones of her father's sins. A 24-hour performance that would either end in freedom or in a body bag. But when Dominic Bishop looked at her with eyes that had seen 3 decades of hell and still found something worth saving in her face, Juno Gordon did the last thing she should have done. She nodded. And somewhere in the city, in a warehouse where a man named Antonio Ricci was waking up with extension cords around his wrists, the first shots of a war were fired, not with bullets, but with a promise. A promise that would either save them both or burn their worlds down together. The transformation took less than 2 hours. Juno stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in Dominic's master bedroom, their bedroom, for the next 24 hours, and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The rust-colored hair had been cut and styled into soft waves that framed her face. The borrowed uniform was gone, replaced by a silk dress the color of twilight that clung to curves she'd forgotten she had. Even her hands had been manicured, the bitten nails now smooth and painted a deep crimson. You're creating a target, she said, her voice barely a whisper in the echoing room. Dominic appeared behind her in the reflection, his own transformation more subtle but no less complete. The blood-stained clothes were replaced by a tailored suit that turned his menace into power. He looked less like a man who hadn't slept in 30 years and more like the kingpin who'd ruled the underworld for 3 decades. I'm creating a wife, he corrected, his hands settling on her shoulders. The touch was professional, practiced, but his fingers lingered against her collarbone where her pulse beat a frantic rhythm. The Calabrians need to believe I've lost my mind over you. That you're my weakness. Am I? The question hung between them, dangerous and honest. Dominic's eyes met hers in the mirror, and for a moment, the predator mask slipped. That's what we're going to find out. Viktor entered without knocking, carrying a velvet box that made Juno's stomach tighten. The rings, he announced, his Russian accent flattening the word into something final. He opened it to reveal 2 bands, platinum, simple, and worth more than every apartment she'd ever lived in combined. Dominic took the larger one and slid it onto his finger without ceremony. Then he took Juno's left hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that felt almost reverent. The ring slipped on easily, perfectly sized, as if it had been waiting for her. How did you know my size? She asked. Viktor answered before Dominic could. We know everything about you now, Ms. Gordon. Your shoe size, your blood type, the name of the stuffed rabbit you still keep in your apartment. He paused, his smile thin as ice. We even know about the journal under your mattress. The one where you write about wanting to be a teacher. Juno's face burned. Dominic's grip tightened, not painful, but possessive. That's enough, Viktor. The Russian held up his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes told a different story. He didn't trust her. Didn't trust this plan. And somewhere in the calculated way he watched them, Juno saw the first seed of doubt take root. The strategy session was a masterclass in deception. Dominic laid out the plan with military precision, moving chess pieces across a map of the old docks where the exchange would happen. The Calabrians will bring 20 men, he explained, his finger tracing the layout. They'll have snipers on these rooftops, a secondary team here and here. They'll expect me to be exhausted, making mistakes. You'll be exhausted, Viktor pointed out. You haven't slept since. I slept 3 hours last night, Dominic interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut. Thanks to my wife. The way he said wife, proud, defiant, almost hungry, made Juno's breath catch. Viktor noticed. His expression darkened. 3 hours after 30 years doesn't make you sharp, Viktor pressed. It makes you vulnerable. What if she's the Calabrians' play? What if they sent her? She didn't know about her father, Dominic said, but Juno heard the first thread of doubt in his voice. The records were sealed. He was a ghost. Ghosts have a way of coming back. The men stared at each other, two predators circling a shared kill. Juno watched the dynamic shift, realizing something crucial. Viktor wasn't just Dominic's enforcer. He was his conscience. His anchor. The last person who could tell him no. And Dominic was choosing Juno over that voice of reason. Get some rest, Dominic finally said, dismissing Viktor. Both of us. We leave at midnight. Alone in the bedroom, the silence became its own character. Juno sat on the edge of the massive bed, her silk dress suddenly feeling like costume armor. Dominic stood by the window, his tie loosened, the ring on his finger catching the light. Do you think he's right? She asked. That I could be? No. The word was immediate, absolute. But he didn't turn to face her. But I think you're scared. And I think you should be. Are you? This time he did turn, and the look on his face stripped her bare. I'm terrified. For 30 years, I had one goal: stay awake. Stay alive. Stay in control. And in 2 days, you've made me consider sleeping again. Permanently. He crossed to her, moving with that predator grace that should have made her recoil. Instead, she found herself leaning forward, meeting him halfway. Show me, he whispered, sitting beside her. Show me how you do it. Do what? Turn it off. The fear. The noise. You live in a world where you're always one step from the edge, but you still find a way to rest. How? Juno looked at her hands, at the perfect crimson nails that looked like someone else's hands. I pretend I'm small. Invisible. If they can't see you, they can't hurt you. Dominic took her chin in his fingers, forcing her to look at him. I see you, he said, his voice low and fierce. And I'm not going to stop. The kiss happened like a car crash, sudden, inevitable, devastating. His lips were rough and demanding, tasting of coffee and 30 years of loneliness. Juno's hands found his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to something real in a world that had become a hall of mirrors. But the moment shattered with the sound of breaking glass. Dominic was off the bed and across the room before Juno could process the noise. He pulled her behind him, his body a wall of muscle and menace, as a small drone, a toy, really, the kind you could buy for $100, crashed through the window and landed on the carpet, its camera lens pointed directly at them. Get dressed, Dominic ordered, his voice ice. Now. He smashed the drone under his heel, but the damage was done. Someone had been watching. Someone had seen the kiss, the ring, the vulnerability. Viktor burst through the door, gun drawn, his face pale. The perimeter's compromised. We have to move. Who? Dominic demanded. Calabrians, Viktor confirmed. But that's not the problem. He held up his phone, showing a text message with a photo attached. The photo showed Juno, hours earlier, leaving her apartment building. A red circle had been drawn around her face. The message below was simple. We know who she is. We know what she owes. Bring her to us, or we bring her to him. Her landlord, Viktor said, his voice flat. Lenny. His Calabrian muscle. Has been for years. She's been paying rent to the family that killed yours. The floor dropped out from under Juno's feet. Lenny. The broken lock. The way he'd watched her. It had never been about rent. It had been about keeping her close, keeping her desperate, keeping her father's daughter exactly where they wanted her. Dominic looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't hunger or protection or even rage. She saw betrayal. Tell me you didn't know, he said again, but this time the words were a blade pressed against her throat. I didn't, she whispered, but the seed Viktor had planted had bloomed into a poisonous flower, and Dominic Bishop, who had finally learned to trust again, was already pulling away. The silence in the penthouse was a living thing, coiling around Juno's throat like a serpent. Dominic's hand had dropped from her face, his expression shuttering closed with the finality of a vault door. Viktor stood in the doorway, gun still drawn, his eyes tracking the distance between them like a referee at a prize fight. Lenny's not Calabrian, Juno whispered, the realization hitting her like a fist. He's just a creep with a spare key. He wouldn't. He doesn't have the connections. He can barely fix a leaky faucet. You're defending him. Dominic's voice was ice over steel. I'm defending me, she shot back, anger finally punching through her fear. You think I'd be 3 months behind on rent if my landlord was a made man? They'd have broken my legs by month 1. That's not how this works. Viktor's jaw tightened. She's lying. We have the texts. The photos. Show me, Juno demanded, taking a step toward him. Dominic's hand shot out, pulling her back, but she shook him off. Show me the text, Viktor. Show me the number. Viktor hesitated. Just for a second, a flicker, a breath, but it was enough. Dominic saw it. His head tilted, a predator sensing the shift in wind. Show her, Dominic said softly, the softness more dangerous than any shout. Viktor pulled out his phone, swiped to the message, and held it up. The number was blocked, the area code generic. But the photo was wrong. It showed Juno leaving her building, yes, but the timestamp in the corner read 1847. She'd been inside her apartment at 6:47 p.m., getting ready for her shift. She remembered because she'd been watching the news, a story about a fire in the Bronx, and she'd thought about her father. That's not me, she said, her voice gaining strength. That's my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She wears her hair in a ponytail like mine. She's about my height. But she leaves at 6:30 every night for her grandson's house. She looked at Dominic. Check the shoes. Mrs. Chen wears those ugly orthopedic sneakers. I wear Converse with holes in the toes. Dominic took the phone from Viktor's hand, zooming in on the photo. The sneakers were white, thick-soled, medical. Not Juno's threadbare cons. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Viktor, Dominic said, his voice so quiet it was almost a caress. Where did you get this photo? From our sources. The Calabrians have been watching her. Stop. Dominic's command was a blade. Stop lying to me. Viktor's face went pale. The gun in his hand wavered. And in that moment, Juno saw it, the crack in the foundation, the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 30 years. Viktor, Dominic repeated, taking a step toward his oldest friend. You sent that text. You sent the drone. You've been working for them all along. The denial died on Viktor's lips before it could be born. Instead, his shoulders straightened, and the man Juno had seen, the loyal enforcer, the concerned friend, dissolved like sugar in rain. What remained was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Working for them. Viktor laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. I built them, Dominic. The Calabrians, the Russians, the Irish, they are all mine. Have been for 15 years. I just let you think you were still in charge. The words hit Dominic like physical blows. He staggered, one hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. You were there. You pulled me from the fire. I pulled you from the fire because you were supposed to die in it, Viktor spat. Your father was weak. He wanted peace, negotiations, legitimacy. I wanted an empire. So I hired Charles Gordon. I gave him the gasoline. I locked the doors from the outside. And I made sure you survived just long enough to be useful. Juno's hand found Dominic's, their fingers intertwining with a desperation that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Viktor saw the gesture and smiled. Oh, that's perfect. The daughter of the man who killed your family. Tell me, Dominic, does she help you sleep because of her sparkling personality? Or because your subconscious finally found the only person whose blood debt matches your own? Dominic's rage was a living thing, filling the room with static electricity. But beneath it, Juno felt something else, his hand trembling in hers, not from exhaustion this time, but from a betrayal so complete it had shattered the foundation of his entire existence. Why now? Dominic asked, his voice raw. You've had 30 years to put a bullet in my head. Because you were a figurehead. A ghost story. The Insomniac King who never made a mistake. Viktor's eyes gleamed with decades of resentment. But then you found her. And suddenly you're sleeping, you're distracted, you're weak. The family started asking questions. They started wondering if maybe the great Dominic Bishop was finally ready to be replaced. He raised the gun, pointing it not at Dominic, but at Juno. So I gave them an answer. I gave them the girl. And I was going to give them your empire. All you had to do was doubt her. Push her away. Let me handle the threat. But you couldn't, could you? You had to choose her. The truth of it settled over them like ash. Viktor had engineered everything, the fake threat, the drone, the careful planting of doubt, because he'd known that Dominic's only weakness was loyalty. And he'd counted on that loyalty to turn Dominic against the one person who could actually save him. Juno stepped forward, placing herself between the gun and Dominic. So what now? You shoot me and hope he breaks. Viktor's finger tightened on the trigger. I shoot you and watch him finally become the monster he was always meant to be. Either way, I win. But Dominic moved faster than any sleep-deprived man should have been able to. He shoved Juno behind him, his body a shield, and faced Viktor with nothing but his bare hands and 30 years of rage. Pull that trigger, Dominic said, and you'll find out what I learned in 30 years without sleep. I learned how to survive without breathing. How to think without blinking. How to kill a man with a whisper. Viktor laughed. You're unarmed. Am I? Dominic's smile was a horror show. Check your pocket. Viktor's free hand instinctively went to his jacket. His face went white. The detonator he found there was small, red, and blinking. Dominic's voice dropped to a whisper. 3 pounds of C4 in the support beam behind you. I planted it when I walked in. Old habit. Always have an exit strategy. You wouldn't, Viktor breathed. You'd die too. I haven't slept in 30 years, Dominic said. I'm already dead. The question is whether you want to join me. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Viktor lowered the gun. Not out of surrender, but calculation. This isn't over. It's over for you, Dominic replied. Get out. Tell the families the Bishop Empire is closed for business. Tell them if they come for her, they come for me. And I don't sleep anymore. I don't blink. I don't forget. Viktor backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving them. You're making a mistake. She's the daughter of. She's the woman who gave me back the night. Dominic's voice cracked with emotion. And I'd burn the world down before I let you take that from me. The door closed. Viktor was gone. Dominic's strength left with him. He crumpled to his knees, his body shaking with a sob that had been 30 years in the making. Juno went down with him, her arms circling his shoulders as he finally broke. I killed them, he whispered into her neck. I trusted him. I let him live. I let him stand beside me while my family rotted. You were a kid, Juno said, her own tears falling now. You were a kid who lost everything. He took advantage of that. That's not your fault. They held each other on the floor of the penthouse, 2 people bound by blood and betrayal, by fire and forgiveness. Juno pressed her lips to his forehead, her hands threading through his hair, and whispered the words she'd never said to anyone, not to her father, not to herself. I see you. I see all of it. And I'm not leaving. Dominic looked up at her, his dark eyes clear for the first time since she'd met him. Your father was a man who made a terrible choice for money. But I'm not him. She cupped his face, forcing him to see her. I'm the woman who stayed. I'm the woman who caught you when you fell. And I'm the woman who's going to help you burn this whole thing down and build something that doesn't need blood to survive. He kissed her then, not with desperation, but with devotion. It was a kiss that tasted of ash and rebirth, of 30 years of darkness finally finding its way back to the light. When they broke apart, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. I haven't slept in 30 years because I was afraid of what I'd find in the dark. But the dark isn't the fire. It's not my family dying. It's not even Viktor's betrayal. What is it? Juno whispered. It's being alone. His voice was raw, stripped of every defense. It's the thought that after everything, I'd still be alone. Juno smiled through her tears. You're not alone anymore. Outside the penthouse, the city kept turning. Viktor would be making his calls, rallying his forces, preparing for war. The Calabrians would be sharpening their knives. The other families would be choosing sides. But inside, on the floor of a fortress built on 30 years of insomnia and rage, Dominic Bishop closed his eyes. And for the first time since he was 16 years old, he let himself be held. The darkness didn't come with fire this time. It came with peace. The peace lasted exactly 47 minutes. Dominic had almost fallen asleep again, his head in Juno's lap on the floor of the penthouse, when the first explosion rocked the building. Not the C4 he'd threatened Viktor with, That had been a bluff, a desperate play with a dead remote. This was real. The concussion blew out the remaining windows, sending glass raining down like crystal shrapnel. Get up. Dominic was on his feet, pulling Juno with him, but his body betrayed him. 30 years of insomnia had exacted its price. The 3 hours of sleep had been a taste of water to a dying man, not salvation. His legs wobbled. His vision blurred at the edges. Juno caught him, her small frame propping up his larger one with a strength that shouldn't have existed. Which way? The safe room. East wing. He pointed toward a wall that looked like solid marble. Palm print on the third panel. Another explosion. This one closer. The floor heaved beneath them, and the lights died. Emergency reds flickered on, painting everything the color of fresh blood and old nightmares. Dominic's phone buzzed. A text from Viktor. You taught me everything, old friend. Including how to burn a kingdom down. Then a video attachment. Juno's apartment building. Flames already licking at the windows of her 4th-floor studio. The lock she'd begged Lenny to fix, now irrelevant. The stuffed rabbit. The journal. The ramen noodles and the threadbare Converse. All of it turning to ash. Juno saw the video over his shoulder. Her hand flew to her mouth, but no sound came out. She'd already lost everything once. She knew how this song ended. He's erasing you, Dominic said, his voice hollow. Making sure you have nothing to go back to. The penthouse door burst open. Not Viktor. Worse. Men in black tactical gear, faces covered, weapons raised. Dominic's own men. His security detail. The ones he'd trusted with his life for years. Boss, the lead man said, his voice muffled. Viktor's orders. The girl comes with us. You stay. Dominic pushed Juno behind him, but his body was a failing shield. I'm still your employer. Not for long. The man raised his rifle. Don't make us hurt you, Mr. Bishop. There were 6 of them. Dominic had 2 bullets in the gun he'd retrieved from under the meat grinder, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim. The sleep had made him weak. The peace had made him vulnerable. Juno saw it. Saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he was measuring the distance, trying to figure out if he could take them all before they took her. Don't, she whispered, her lips against his ear. Not for me. Everything for you, he whispered back. He moved. Not toward the men, but toward the shattered window. It was a 30-story drop to the street below, but there was a ledge, narrow, suicidal, but there. He'd had it installed years ago as an escape route he'd never thought he'd use. Run with me, he said, pulling her toward the gaping hole where the glass had been. The wind howled through the opening, cold and indifferent. Juno looked at the ledge, at the men with guns, at Dominic's face, which was no longer the face of a king, but of a boy who'd just found something worth living for and was about to lose it. They ran. The ledge was 4 inches wide, slick with night dew and glass dust. Dominic pressed himself against the building, one arm around Juno's waist, the other finding handholds in the architectural details. Behind them, the men slowed at the window, unwilling to follow onto the ledge of death. They won't risk it, Dominic breathed. Not yet. But Viktor had anticipated this too. A spotlight snapped on from the building opposite, pinning them in its beam like insects on a card. Then another. And another. The entire city seemed to be watching now, this absurd, deadly dance 30 stories up. Dominic Bishop. A voice boomed through a megaphone. Not Viktor's. The Calabrian underboss, Carlo Rizzi. You have something that belongs to us. She doesn't belong to anyone. Dominic shouted back, his voice raw against the wind. Her father owed a debt. Blood for blood. Dominic's grip tightened on Juno. Her father is dead. Debts don't die. Carlo's voice was gleeful. But you will. Unless you send her across. Now. The ledge ended 10 feet to their left, terminating at a maintenance ladder that led to the roof. Between them and it was a gap, a 3-foot jump across empty air to the next building's ledge. It was the kind of jump Dominic could have made easily, before. Before the sleep. Before the weakness. Can you jump? He asked Juno, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the gap. Can you? She countered. He didn't answer. Couldn't. The truth was in the tremor of his hands, the way his legs felt like water. The megaphone crackled again. You have 30 seconds, Bishop. Then we take her anyway. How? Juno shouted back, her fear turning to fury. We're 30 stories up. A bullet pinged off the concrete above their heads. A warning shot. The next one wouldn't miss. Dominic made the calculation in a heartbeat. He could jump. Maybe. Probably. But his body wasn't his own anymore. The 3 hours of sleep had reminded his muscles what rest felt like, and now they were demanding more. He was a lion with a thorn in his paw, and the hyenas had caught the scent of blood. Take me, Juno said suddenly, her voice clear and calm. Give me to them. No. Yes. She turned in his arms, forcing him to look at her. The spotlight made her look like an angel carved from marble, beautiful and doomed. If you die, I die. If they take me, you live. You can come for me. You can. I can't. The words tore out of him, raw and broken. Don't you understand? I spent 30 years building a world where I didn't need anyone. And in 2 days, you became the only thing holding me together. If they take you, I don't survive it. Not as the man you saved. The confession hung between them, more intimate than any kiss. Juno's eyes filled with tears that the wind immediately stole away. Then we jump together. You'll fall. Then I'll fall with you. The simplicity of it broke something in him. 30 years of control, of calculation, of never letting anyone close enough to matter. And this girl, this impossible girl, was willing to die with him rather than live without him. 10 seconds. Carlo's voice boomed. Dominic looked at the gap. At the ladder. At Juno's face, which had become his entire world. Hold on, he whispered. Tight as you can. He jumped. For a moment, there was nothing but air and adrenaline and the scream of wind in their ears. Juno's arms locked around his neck, her legs around his waist, holding on with a strength born of pure terror. Dominic's fingers caught the edge of the opposite ledge, his body slamming against the building with enough force to crack ribs. His grip held. They dangled, 40 stories above the street, held by nothing but Dominic's bleeding fingers and the sheer stubbornness of a man who'd refused to die for 3 decades. Climb, he grunted, his voice strangled. Juno, climb over me. She did, her hands finding holds in the brick, her feet scrambling for purchase. She pulled herself onto the ledge, then reached down, grabbing Dominic's wrist with both hands. I've got you. Pull. He pulled. Muscles screaming, fingers slipping on blood and concrete dust, he hauled himself up until he could roll onto the narrow ledge beside her. They lay there, chests heaving, the city spinning below them like a carnival ride designed by the devil. The megaphone crackled again, but this time the voice was different. Closer. Impressive. But pointless. They looked up. Viktor stood on the roof above them, flanked by 6 men with rifles. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked tired, almost sad. Bring her up, Dominic. Or I drop you both. Dominic's hand found Juno's, their fingers intertwining. The ring on her finger, the fake marriage that had become devastatingly real, caught the spotlight and threw it back like a challenge. She stays with me, Dominic said, his voice carrying up to the roof. Always. Viktor sighed. I really hoped it wouldn't come to this. He gestured. One of the men stepped forward with something that wasn't a rifle. It was a launcher. A net launcher, the kind used to catch dangerous animals. Last chance, Viktor called down. Dominic looked at Juno. Really looked at her, memorizing the freckles across her nose, the way her hair whipped in the wind, the green of her eyes that had become his anchor in a sea of darkness. Trust me, he whispered. Then he let go of the ledge. They fell. The net caught them 20 feet down, a tangled mesh of synthetic fiber that wrapped around their bodies like a spider's web. The impact knocked the breath from Juno's lungs, and she felt Dominic's body curl around hers, protecting her head, her neck, her spine as they slammed into the side of the building and dangled, a captured trophy for Viktor's victory. Got you, Viktor's voice came from above, but it was distant, muffled by the ringing in her ears. The last thing Juno saw before darkness took her was Dominic's face, blooded but unbroken, his lips forming 3 words she couldn't hear over the roar of blood in her ears. But she knew what they were. I love you. It was the most impossible, irrational, beautiful lie in the world. And it was the only thing she had left to hold on to as the net tightened, and the world went black. Consciousness returned to Juno like a slap, sharp, painful, immediate. She was still in the net, still wrapped in Dominic's protective embrace, still 40 stories above the pavement. But something had changed. The spotlight was gone. The megaphone silence. Above them, the roof was empty. "They're moving us," Dominic whispered, his voice a thread of sound against her ear. The net was being winched upward, slow and mechanical. "Stay limp. Play dead." Juno forced her body to relax, letting her head loll against his shoulder. She could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, too fast, too irregular. The fall, the net, the betrayal had cost him something vital. "Your heart is fine," he lied. "Listen to me. Viktor's taking us to the old Bishop house. In Queens. It's where he took me after the fire, where he saved me. It's his trophy room." "How do you?" "Because it's the only place he'd want to end this." The net jerked, and they were hauled over the roof's edge. Viktor's men stood in a loose circle, guns trained, but Dominic's eyes were only on the helicopter idling nearby. "He needs to see me broken there. Needs to wipe the slate clean." They were dumped onto the concrete, hands zip-tied behind their backs. Viktor crouched beside them, his expression unreadable. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Dominic." The drone, the photo, the landlord, almost had her doubting you. "Almost," Dominic agreed, his voice flat. Viktor's smile was a thin line. "But not quite. Because she sees you. Really sees you." He stood, gesturing for his men to lift them. "That's what makes this so delicious. You'll die knowing she was the real thing. And she'll live knowing she couldn't save you." They were shoved into the helicopter, Juno and Dominic pressed shoulder to shoulder in the cramped cabin. As the rotors spun up and the city fell away beneath them, Dominic did something extraordinary. He fell asleep. Not passed out. Not collapsed. Deliberately, intentionally, he let his head drop to Juno's shoulder, his breathing slow and deep. The rhythm was hypnotic, practiced, the breathing pattern she'd taught him in the warehouse, the one she'd used on her father during his worst nights. Juno understood. This wasn't surrender. It was a weapon. The flight took 17 minutes. Dominic slept through all of them, his body finally trusting her enough to let go completely. Viktor watched with a mixture of disgust and fascination. 30 years, and now he sleeps like a baby. Unbelievable. The helicopter landed in the overgrown yard of a burnt-out shell of a house. The Bishop family home. The place where Dominic's nightmare had begun. Juno could still smell the ghost of smoke, the phantom of gasoline. They were dragged inside, into what had once been a living room. Scorched beams loomed overhead like the ribs of a dead giant. In the center of the room stood a single chair. A metal folding chair, the kind Juno's father had used in his workshop. "Sit him there," Viktor ordered. "Tie him tight. I want him to watch." They forced Dominic into the chair, binding his wrists to the armrests with heavy chains. He was still asleep, his head lolling forward. Viktor slapped him awake, the crack of flesh on flesh echoing through the ruined house. Dominic's eyes opened slowly, dreamily. He looked at Viktor, at Juno, at the chains. And he smiled. "You're going to regret letting me sleep," he said, his voice soft as a lullaby. Viktor laughed. "You're chained to a chair in a burning house, my friend. I think I'm doing just fine." But Juno saw it, the thing Viktor had missed. The zip tie around her own wrists was loose. Not cut, not broken. Just loose. As if it had never been tightened properly. As if someone had wanted her to have a way out. Dominic caught her eye and gave the slightest nod. The key to solving the central conflict wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a hidden army or a secret fortune. It was trust. Complete, absolute, irrational trust. Viktor turned away, barking orders at his men. In that moment, Juno slipped her hands free. She had seconds. Maybe less. She moved like smoke, like she'd learned to move in 1,000 empty warehouses and shadowed alleys. Invisible. Her fingers found the detonator in Dominic's jacket pocket, the real one, not the bluff. Her other hand found the small knife he'd slipped into her waistband while they were still in the net, a whisper of metal against skin. She palmed the knife and waited. Viktor turned back, his gun aimed at Dominic's head. "Any last words for your blushing bride?" Dominic's smile grew. "Just one. Juno." She moved. The knife flashed, slicing through the chain on his left wrist. The detonator clicked on. The house trembled. "Run," Dominic told Viktor, his voice almost kind. "Run now." Viktor's face went white. "You wouldn't, you can't, this is your family's house." "It's a tomb," Dominic said, standing, the last chain falling away. "And you already in it." The explosion wasn't big. It was precise. Viktor's men had planted charges to make it look like a gas leak, part of his plan to fake their deaths. Dominic had simply repurposed them. The back wall of the house blew outward, creating an exit. Viktor ran for it, his men scattering. Dominic pulled Juno close, his lips against her temple. "You trusted me." "You let me," she whispered back. "Not just me." He took her hand, pressing it to his chest. "You trusted yourself. That's the key." The final confrontation wasn't with Viktor. It was with the ghosts. With the fear that had kept Dominic awake for 30 years. He walked to the center of the burned room, to the spot where his family's bodies had been found, and he lay down. Right there, on the scorched floor, he closed his eyes. "Stay with me," he whispered. Juno lay beside him, her head on his chest, their hands clasped over the ring that had started as a lie and become their truth. The fire had taken everything from him. But this trust, this love, this willingness to let go, this was how they took it back. Viktor ran. Through the blown-out wall, across the overgrown yard, toward the waiting convoy of black SUVs that had brought them here. He was still laughing, high, wild, the sound of a man who'd finally cashed in 30 years of resentment. The explosion had been smaller than he'd expected, but the escape was clean. Dominic was still trapped in that burning mausoleum of memory, and Juno. Juno was supposed to be dead weight. A liability. The final twist of the knife. But as Viktor reached the lead vehicle, his hand on the door handle, he realized something was wrong. The driver wasn't his man. The man behind the wheel wore a suit that was too expensive, a smile that was too calm, and eyes that belonged to someone who'd been waiting a very long time for this moment. "Carlo Rizzi," Viktor breathed. "What the hell are you doing here?" Carlo stepped out of the SUV, flanked by 6 men who weren't Calabrian. They were Dominic's. Had always been Dominic's. "I'm here," Carlo said, his voice smooth as Italian silk, "to deliver a message from the man you tried to bury." Viktor's hand moved for his gun, but he was already surrounded. Not just by Carlo's men, but by representatives from every family he'd claimed to control. The Russians. The Irish. The old-timers from the 5 families who'd supposedly been extinct for a decade. They hadn't been extinct. They'd been waiting. The sound of clapping made Viktor turn. Dominic emerged from the house, Juno at his side, both of them covered in soot but very much alive. The clapping was slow, deliberate, and it echoed across the abandoned neighborhood like a death knell. 30 years, Dominic said, his voice carrying in the pre-dawn stillness. "For 30 years, I let you think you were the puppet master. I let you plant your spies, corrupt my men, build your little coalition. And you know what I learned while you were busy consolidating power." He stopped 5 feet from Viktor, close enough to see the sweat beading on his former friend's forehead. "I learned that loyalty can't be bought. It can only be earned." Juno stepped forward, holding up the detonator. "This wasn't just an escape switch," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It was a broadcast signal. Every earpiece, every phone, every wire your men were wearing, it's been feeding directly to every boss you thought you'd turned." Viktor's face went white. "That's impossible. I swept for bugs." "You swept for my bugs," Dominic corrected. "The ones I let you find. But the real network? That was built by the people you dismissed. The janitors. The drivers. The girls who clean your offices on weekends." He looked at Juno with pride. "The invisible ones." The twist landed like a physical blow. Viktor staggered. "The warehouse, the girl, you planned this." "No." Dominic's smile was sharp and sad. "The warehouse was a coincidence. Juno was a miracle. But once I had her, once I saw how you reacted to her, I knew it was time." He took Juno's hand, their rings catching the first light of dawn. "You taught me everything, Viktor. Including how to wait." The final piece clicked into place. Dominic's insomnia hadn't been a weakness. It had been his greatest strength. For 30 years, he'd been awake, watching, listening, building a network of loyalty that ran deeper than blood. He'd let Viktor think the sleep deprivation was breaking him, when in reality, it had made him hyper-aware of every betrayal, every plot, every whispered conversation in the dark. The 3 hours of sleep Juno had given him? That was the signal. The moment Viktor thought Dominic had finally become vulnerable enough to move against. The trap had been set not by Dominic's strength, but by his willingness to show weakness. Viktor's knees buckled. He looked at the faces surrounding him, men he'd bribed, threatened, manipulated, and saw only contempt. He'd been playing checkers while Dominic played chess in 4 dimensions. "You're going to kill me," Viktor said, his voice empty. "No," Dominic replied. "You're going to live. In a cell. And every day, you're going to remember that the boy you tried to burn alive grew up to be the man who could have killed you, but chose to let you live with your failure." He turned to Carlo. "Take him. Make sure he's comfortable. And make sure he gets a window. I want him to see the sunrise every morning. I want him to remember what it looks like when the darkness finally ends." As Viktor was led away, Dominic pulled Juno close. "I need you to do one more thing for me. Anything. Sleep with me. For real this time. No nightmares. No ghosts. Just sleep." They walked back into the burned house, not as a tomb, but as a beginning. Dominic lay down on the scorched floor where his childhood bedroom had been, and Juno curled beside him. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 30 years, the darkness didn't come with fire. It came with her hand in his, her breath on his cheek, her heartbeat syncing with his. He slept. Deeply. Dreamlessly. The sleep of the innocent, the forgiven, the loved. When he woke 10 hours later, the sun was streaming through the holes in the roof, and Juno was still beside him, watching him with eyes that held no pity, only peace. "Welcome back," she whispered. He kissed her, not with desperation, but with the simple gratitude of a man who'd finally found his way home. 6 months later, Juno stood in front of a classroom of 3rd graders, teaching them about photosynthesis. The ring on her finger caught the light from the window, and one of the little girls, a quiet thing with rust-colored hair and green eyes, raised her hand. "Miss Gordon, is it true your husband never sleeps?" Juno smiled. "He used to have trouble sleeping. But now he sleeps just fine. Because of you. Because of us." Across town, Dominic Bishop sat in a boardroom that no longer dealt in blood. His empire had been dismantled, piece by piece, and rebuilt into something that funded schools, hospitals, shelters for kids who'd lost everything. The other families had tested him once, early on. But when they'd seen what he'd become, a man who'd faced his ghosts and chosen love over vengeance, they'd backed down. He'd become a ghost story of a different kind. The Insomniac King who'd finally learned to dream. His phone buzzed. A text from Juno, picking up Chinese. "You asleep?" He typed back, "Not yet. Waiting for you." And he meant it. He could sleep now. He could close his eyes and find darkness without fire, silence without screams. But he found he didn't want to. Not if it meant missing a single moment with her. The final twist hadn't been Viktor's betrayal. It hadn't been the trap or the escape or even the confession of love. The twist was this: the man who hadn't slept in 30 years had finally found something worth staying awake for. The wedding was small, illegal, and perfect. They held it on the rebuilt foundation of the Bishop family home, now a community center with Juno's classroom on the 2nd floor. Dominic wore a suit that cost less than her second-hand dress, and the only witness was Mrs. Chen, who'd finally admitted she'd been feeding information to Dominic's invisible network for years. "She was my eyes and ears on you," Dominic confessed as they signed the paper that made them real. "I had to make sure you were safe. Even when I didn't know why." Juno signed her name with a flourish, then leaned over to kiss the scar above his eyebrow. "You could have just asked me out for coffee." "I don't drink coffee," he murmured. "It keeps me up." They both laughed, a sound that still surprised them, clean and bright and free. 3 years later, Juno Gordon Bishop stood at the window of their apartment, a real one, with a lock that worked and a view of the park, and watched her husband push their daughter on a swing. The little girl had his dark eyes and Juno's stubborn chin, and she'd been sleeping through the night since she was 6 weeks old. Dominic caught her watching and waved, the gesture of a man who'd forgotten how to be a ghost. Inside, the phone rang. It was Viktor, calling from the facility where he spent his days watching sunrises and his nights writing letters that never got sent. Dominic spoke to him once a month. Not out of mercy, but reminder. "How is he?" Juno asked when he came inside, smelling of autumn air and baby shampoo. "Awake," Dominic said, pulling her close. "Always awake." Lenny had been easier. One conversation with Carlo Rizzi, and the landlord had suddenly forgiven all debts, fixed the lock, and moved to Florida. He sent a Christmas card every year. Juno burned them. The true ending came on a Tuesday, in the quiet of their bedroom. Dominic had been asleep for 4 hours, deep, dreamless, perfect sleep, when Juno felt him stir. She reached for him, her hand finding his in the dark. "Same dream," she whispered. "Better one." He pulled her close, his lips against her forehead. "I was dreaming about vacuum cleaners and threadbare uniforms. About a girl who didn't scream when she should have." She smiled into his chest. "That's not a dream. That's our origin story." "Same thing." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to mean ghosts. Now it just meant thought. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "The fire didn't take my ability to sleep." His voice was soft, reverent. "It just took the person I trusted enough to close my eyes around. It took me 30 years to find her. But she was worth every single night." Juno pressed her palm over his heart, feeling the steady, strong beat that no longer raced with memory. "You're not the Insomniac King anymore." "No," he agreed. "I'm just a man who loves his wife. And finally gets to rest." He was asleep again within minutes. Juno stayed awake, watching him, counting his breaths like blessings. She'd spent her life being invisible, cleaning up other people's messes. Now she was seen. Now she was the reason the most dangerous man in the world had learned to be gentle. The story didn't end with a kingdom or a crown. It ended with a teacher grading spelling tests at the kitchen table while her husband made coffee he wouldn't drink. It ended with a little girl's laughter floating up from the park. It ended with a man who hadn't slept in 30 years, snoring softly against his wife's shoulder. It ended with the simplest, most revolutionary truth. You don't find peace by running from the dark. You find it by finding someone who'll hold your hand while you walk through it. If you made it this far, if you felt that twist in your gut when Viktor betrayed him, if you held your breath during the ledge jump, if you cried when Dominic finally slept, then do me a favor. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was the moment that broke you? The moment that made you believe these two broken people could actually make each other whole? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this, the ones that remind us love isn't about perfection, but about finding the person who makes the darkness bearable, those are the stories worth staying awake for. Just ask Dominic Bishop. He knows. The end.